All right. Well, today we're going to be talking about federalism. As per usual, you're going to take notes by dividing your paper in half, writing the term in blue on the left and the definition in pink on the right. So, what the heck is federalism? First of all, this is the constitutional division of power between the national government and the state governments. Now, both the federal and the state governments must follow the Constitution. So let's break this definition down. We have one federal government that governs all 50 states, and that's in Washington, D.C. We also have 50 state legislatures that govern each state. The Constitution lays out the powers held by each. However, there's still a lot of debate and conflict about how these powers should be interpreted. So if you've heard debates over states' rights, that's what this is getting into. All right, so just some illustrations there. We've got our federal legislature, which is Congress over in DC. And then we've got our state legislature, which in our case would be the California State Legislature in Sacramento. All right, just another illustration. We also have a federal executive, that would be the president. And then we've also got state executives, and for us, that would be Gavin Newsom. All right, well, why do we have a federal system? So after independence, before we had a constitution, we had a system that's called a confederal system. And that was under a document called the Articles of Confederation, which I mentioned in class was like our first constitution before the actual constitution that we got. It was our rough draft. And what this did is it created a federal government, but the federal government was very, very, very weak and dependent on the states. So there wasn't an executive, there was no president. The federal government couldn't tax, it couldn't raise a military, which meant that it couldn't protect against a rebellion. Therefore, the framers decided that we needed to scrap this system and create a stronger federal system of government with a stronger federal government that had more authority over the states than under the Articles of Confederation. All right, well, what powers do each of these parties have? So let's start with the powers of the national government. And there are three types of powers which you're going to need to know. First of all, there's expressed powers, which you'll also see called enumerated powers. And these are federal powers that are actually explicitly stated in the Constitution in Article 1, Section 8, which you've already seen a little bit of. So one of the examples of this, right, is Congress has the power to regulate interstate commerce, so things that are bought and sold across state lines, right? Now, the next kind of power is called an implied power, and these are federal powers that are not stated explicitly in the Constitution, but are suggested implicitly or implied because they are necessary to carry out the expressed powers, right? So, for example, there's nothing in the Constitution that explicitly says that Congress is allowed to regulate the sale of produce across state lines, but that would fall under the category of interstate commerce, right? The framers couldn't actually sit down and list out every single item that could be traded across state lines, right? So this is implied by that expressed power up there. Now, the third and final type of national or federal power is called inherent powers. And these are federal powers not stated explicitly in the Constitution, but held by the national government just because it's a national sovereign government that's not controlled by any other government, right? And an example of this would be the power to regulate immigration, right? If a country has borders, it seems to suggest that that country would be able to conduct foreign policy and regulate immigration and so on and so on. Every single sovereign country is able to do that, whether they're the United States or Japan or France, etc., etc. All right, now what powers do the states have? So the states also have some powers that only they are allowed to have, and these are called reserved powers. And the definition is powers the Constitution does not grant to the federal government and instead are reserved by the states. Now, these are protected by the 10th Amendment, which we looked at a little bit in class when we looked at the Bill of Rights. And that says that the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. So what that's saying there, right, is if it's not explicitly granted to the federal government, then it's either reserved by the states or by the people, which is where that name reserved powers come from. And examples of this would be setting education standards and licensing professionals, right? So my teaching credential is granted to me by the state of California, not by the federal government, and California sets its own education standards, which is why you learn about California state history in 4th grade and not, I don't know, Texas state history. All right. Now, there are some powers that the federal and the state governments share. These are called concurrent powers. So that word concur, right, means to agree. So if that helps you remember, that's a little tip there. So concurrent powers are powers that both the federal and the state governments can exercise. And really the number one example to remember here is levying taxes or collecting taxes. That's what that means. So for example, right, you probably know if you have a job, if you look at your paycheck, you notice that the federal government takes out taxes and the state government takes out taxes. When you pay your tax return in the spring, you pay federal taxes and you pay state taxes, and you mail off two different checks, right, if you owe money. An additional example of a concurrent power is also solving and punishing crimes. So if you watch a lot of crime shows, you might know that there's a federal law enforcement, right, so the FBI, but there's also state and local police departments who also have the responsibility for solving and punishing crimes. Or rather, it'd be the justice system that would punish the crimes and the detectives who solve them. All right, so here is a table. I'm going to post it along with this video, and this will help you keep track of what is what. You're going to need to know this. We're going to practice it on the quizzes, and any of these could be on the test. So let's just take a real quick look. In terms of what are some federal powers, declaring war. Doesn't really make sense that California could declare war on its own. That seems like a federal responsibility, which it is. Maintaining the military, which goes along with that. Regulating interstate and foreign trade, so trade between the states as well as between other countries. Admitting new states to the Union. Establishing post offices. Setting standard weights and measures. Coining money, right? It would be really weird if there's a California dollar and a Nebraska dollar. That would make a lot of sense. The federal government also conducts foreign policy and then makes all other laws, quote unquote, necessary and proper to carry out the duties listed above. And we'll look at what that necessary and proper thing means in just a second. In terms of shared powers, here are some examples. States, as we mentioned, maintain law and order as well as the federal government. Both the state and the federal government carry or collect taxes. They both borrow money. They both create banks. They both establish courts. And they both provide for the public welfare. In terms of things that are reserved to the states, those would be running schools, establishing local governments, regulating business within the state, regulating voting, which is why it takes a different, since California runs voting slightly differently than other states, right? And the requirements are slightly different. States grant professional licenses, as we mentioned. They make marriage laws, and of course, they hold any other power not expressly delegated to the federal government that is prohibited to the states. All right. Wait a minute. So if the Constitution lists all of these powers, why is there so much confusion and argument about what is a state power and what is a federal power? So, for example, California legalized recreational marijuana, but recreational and medical marijuana, for that matter, is illegal at the federal level. Well, how does that work? Why is it illegal at the federal level, but legal at the state level? That doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. Well, the answer is that remember that many of Congress's powers are implied. They're not stated explicitly. The framers knew they couldn't list every single power that Congress would need to carry out its express powers. And the source of Congress's implied powers are two very broadly worded clauses or parts of the Constitution in Article 1. And these are called the necessary and proper, also called the elastic clause, as well as the commerce clause. Let's take a closer look at what those are and how they work. All right, so the necessary and proper clause, you'll also see it called the elastic clause, states that the federal government has the power to do what is quote unquote necessary and proper to carry out its express powers. And this again is a source of in general Congress's implied powers. Now, there's the text of it there. The Congress shall have the powers to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States or any department or officer thereof, right? So basically what that means is that Congress can make any law that is necessary and proper to do things like coin money or establish a bank or regulate the post office, et cetera, regulate interstate commerce, which is actually something slightly different. We'll get into that in a second. So basically, all those things that are explicitly listed in the Constitution that Congress is allowed to do, Congress is also allowed by the necessary and proper clause to do anything that will help it carry out those expressed powers, right? So the Supreme Court in the past has really been the one to decide what is necessary and what is proper. And the more broadly the Supreme Court has defined what is necessary and proper, that's a little typo there, the more power it gives to the federal government. So more broadly that it interprets that clause, the more power it gives to the federal government. All right. Another source of Congress's implied powers is the Commerce Clause. And this is the clause in the Constitution that states that the federal government has the power to regulate interstate commerce, which means buying and selling between the states, right? And again, this is another really important source, along with the Necessary and Proper Clause, of Congress's implied powers. Now, this seems pretty straightforward on its face, right? The Congress shall have the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations, among the several states, and with the Indian tribes. Now, that seems straightforward, right? Well, it's commerce, people buying and selling things, right? But again, this has been subject to interpretation as well. So the Supreme Court has defined interstate commerce differently over time. And again, a lot like the Necessary and Proper Clause, the more broadly the Supreme Court defines interstate commerce, the more loosely it interprets that phrase, the more power it gives to the federal government, because now it enables the federal government to regulate this action. So one of my favorite court cases about this has to do with a guy back during the Great Depression who was he was not selling his wheat. He was a farmer. He was just keeping it on his farm, not selling it because the price was too low. And the federal government actually decided that counted as interstate commerce, because what they said is that if everybody like this guy decided not to sell their crop, well, that would affect interstate commerce eventually, right? So what that did is it gave Congress the authority to regulate what this guy was doing, and they told him he had to sell his crop. All right. So last clause that we need to know is the Supremacy Clause. So the question here is, well, what happens if a state passes a law that conflicts with federal law? So like California, what happens if we legalize marijuana, but the federal government chooses not to? Well, the state law theoretically is invalid. So the Supremacy Clause states that state laws cannot violate the federal law. And of course, both can't violate the Constitution. But if marijuana is illegal at the federal level, why is it still legal in California? Doesn't that seem like the Supremacy Clause would invalidate the California law? Well, then now we get into a little bit of a little tricky situation, right? The federal government has to be willing to enforce its own laws. So it has to be willing to enforce federal law. So technically, the DEA, which is the Federal Drug Enforcement Agency, could shut down the entire marijuana industry in California if they wanted to do so. But they know that move probably wouldn't be very popular, so they haven't done it yet. So technically, when we look at this kind of thing, the federal government has to be willing to enforce its laws.